Fire away.
So what do you think about the results in the Senate and also kind of fluid results in the House right now?
Well, it's about what I said. It's going to be close. I was surprised by one Senate race in particular, the Jerry Brown Caldwell race. That's the one that surprised me. The others were either expected or were close enough that they were so competitive that you I couldn't tell what was going to happen. The House is really a surprise. It's much closer than I thought it'd be. The big surprise there, from my standpoint, was the Fred Smith race down in Arkadelphia, which is notoriously a Democratic stronghold. But when I was down there a week or so ago, I got an inkling that the Republican running was somebody that apparently was well liked, coached Little League Baseball for everybody's kid for years and years, and had worked very, very hard. So even though that's a surprise, I had some kind of inkling about it. But it's what I said all along. No matter who wins, it's going to be fairly equally divided legislature. And they're going to have to work together. Now, there's some good news in that regard. Senator Lamoureux, who is the projected leader of the Senate now, called me this morning and said that he's been trying to tell people this for a few days. It doesn't get in the news, but he authorized me to tell him because he figured I'd get it in the news. That the partisanship he doesn't expect to exist, that he's going to work with Democrats. He wants to work with me, that the Senate is going to work, he said, in a bipartisan manner, that he doesn't want it to look like Washington, and that he expects the Senate to continue the tradition that it's had in the past, and that he looks forward to working with me in a cooperative fashion. That's what he said. And he authorized me to tell you all that.
With 135 legislators, how do you do that? I mean, it's more than just the leadership. How do you project that?
And it's difficult, obviously, but you know, it can be done. I'm ever the optimist. You had a close split last time. It was the other way. What was it, 53-46 or something like that, Democrat and Republican in the House, and it was 20-15 or something like that, Democrat to Republican in the Senate. So you had a relatively close division last time, and on most issues, even though there was a lot of posturing early, and even though it sometimes took 2 or 3 votes to get it done, they worked together for the most part. For the most part, they work together. There'll be times when it'll just line up, as it always does, in a divide. But for the most part, I think they've got enough on both sides of the aisle. Republicans and Democrats have got enough caring about Arkansas that that they'll figure this out. They don't want the voter. The voters don't like what's going on with gridlock in Washington, even though it looks like they voted to keep it that way. But that may be more a function, you know, of the way the system works in terms of the way districts are drawn and the way you have to appeal to your base in these primary elections, and so they better get it figured out in Washington. But I'm always optimistic that Arkansas won't act like those folks up there.
You don't expect partisanship in the Senate from Senator Lamoureux. What about the House? When you heard from him?
You know, not yet, but I expect the House will be reasonable as well. I mean, it's either going to be 50-50 or what, 51-48-1, or I mean, who knows? Under any scenario, it's virtually a dead heat. They got to work together. They absolutely have to work together. And part of my job is to encourage, persuade, plead, cajole, to get them to work together.
How does this change things for you in terms of your agenda for next year,
Doesn't.
especially the Medicaid expansion?
It doesn't. It doesn't change anything in my agenda. My agenda continues to be the two cornerstones of economic development and education. And that's not going to change. My agenda continues to be, with regard to tax relief, the sales tax on food first. That's not going to change. They may have a different view, but it's not changing my agenda. Am I willing to work with them? Absolutely. Always have been. Did last time, and will continue to do so. I mean, you know, it's a democracy. In terms of Medicaid expansion, as I told you all from the outset, that's going to take a 3/4 vote to appropriate that money. And under any scenario, it was going to take a 3/4 vote. And under any scenario, it was going to be close to 50-50 legislatively. So nobody was going to get close to a 75%. So if the two sides can't get together and figure this stuff out, then it is what it is.
There were 3 controversial GOP candidates in this election.
They all lost.
Made some statements.
They all lost.
And they all lost. What do you think that says?
I think that says you better be careful what kind of strange positions you take, because the Arkansas electorate's going to speak when they hear stuff like what those 3 candidates espouse.
Did it surprise you?
No. No.
What about the ballot, 3 ballot proposals? Are you surprised that the voters approved sales tax increase?
On for highways?
Yes, sir.
No, I wasn't surprised because of the polling data we'd seen. And I, you know, that's one thing about this. Everybody's doing polls, but polls tend to be right. I mean, well, the polls tend to be pretty good precursors and forecasters of what's going to happen. And to answer your question, polling data from the last month or two suggested that Arkansans were going to support the half-cent sales tax for 10 years for highways. And they did by a pretty substantial margin. Now, here's the irony. The irony is there were a lot of charges against some incumbent, particularly incumbent Democrats in the legislature, where they said, where they were charging them with voting for tax increases or voting to allow tax increases. And some of those ads and some of those attacks might have been very successful. But at the very same time, the people who are lambasting folks for letting the people vote on that have to recognize that a pretty good percentage of the Arkansas populace actually voted to do that. But that's ironic, I guess.
How do you think that the House and Senate leadership ought to handle they've selected designates for Teague and Williams in the future if the Republicans are going to be in the majority? How do you think they ought to handle that change in leadership?
Oh, I think they'll handle it internally. That, you know, Roby, you've heard me say this so many times that you probably know what I'm going to say based on your question. So it's probably a rhetorical question on your part. Yeah, go ahead and answer.
You think that you ought to let them handle their business internally? You should stay out of it because you didn't want the governor messing with your politics.
Exactly.
But he doesn't have a microphone in front of him, so this.
What he said.
What about the medical marijuana measure? Were you surprised it was as close?
Yes. Yeah, I was surprised about that. I was surprised it was really, really close. You know, I don't know that I saw a lot of polling on that one. I may have. It all kind of runs together, but I was surprised how close that was, yeah.
Does that change your view at all to see there's so much support?
Oh, no. No, my view was, my concern with that was twofold. It had nothing to do with the compassion part of it, which, you know, there were some ads that touched me. I mean, you know, there are some legitimate arguments in terms of healthcare compassion that I don't quarrel with at all. My two concerns were, one, it was going to cost the health department a bunch of money that I didn't know where we were going to get it from, the way the amendment was drawn, to administer all this stuff. And they were giving me figures, I don't remember what all they were now, but they were pretty high, about the number of people that would have to be employed. And you know, one way to do that, I guess, was to tax that stuff, which I'd have been all for. But there were so many people running on no tax pledges, I didn't know whether or not that was even going to be possible if it passed. So that was a concern. The other concern is, and I don't know how this gets resolved, particularly now with what happened in Washington and Colorado, it's against federal law. And so you put your people in that position where, well, they think it's okay in state law, but then it's still illegal federally, and then you get selective enforcement. I think I read where some federal prosecutor or some federal enforcement was going on in Montana, even though they had, I think it was Montana, even though they had allowed it for medicinal purposes. So you get into that selective enforcement, so you get a lot of your people trapped, and then they say, why are you doing this to me? We voted to legalize it. And so a lot of people don't understand that distinction. Those were my two concerns.
Getting back to the sales tax increase, how do you explain that the state that elects 4 Republicans, who I think all 4 signed the no tax pledge? The no tax pledge was huge in majority of the House and Senate races, and then voters approve a half-cent sales tax. How does you make sense of that?
How do you explain 2010 when it was the biggest this wasn't the big Republican surge. They may have gained majorities, but the big Republican surge was in 2010. I mean, that's where the huge number change was, including in constitutional officers and including in our congressional races. How do you explain that in me, Gary, in every county with the biggest percentage of vote? How do you explain 1968 with Fulbright, Rockefeller, and George Wallace? I think how you explain all that is what I've been saying since y'all been asking me the same question for the last 2 years. Arkansans are notoriously independent in their thought process. They vote if they know you and feel like they know you to the point that they, other than just merely a name, if they really feel like they know you for good or bad, they're going to vote for you or against you, regardless of what's by your name. If they think a tax is going to be something that's going to specifically do something they want, all this no tax stuff goes out the window and they'll vote for the tax. You see it in school elections particularly. You really see it a lot because if a lot of folks who are against all taxes will end up voting to increase their property taxes many times if they believe it's going to actually help their local school district. So I think the answer to the question is this. You can't explain it in any way other than Arkansans are notoriously independent in their thought process, and just they'll do what they believe is best for their own community, their children, their own people, if they know a lot about the issue. Now, if they don't, they usually default to the no tax.
Governor, since Arkansans are notoriously independent, what, if any, changes need to happen then to reverse some of these trends for the Democratic Party?
Oh, I think it's all about the candidates. I think it's all about the candidates. I think you can look up and down this ballot. I think it's all about the candidates, and sometimes good candidates lose because it's the trend. But more often than not, you can buck trends with the kind of personal relationships with candidates. But that's what you got to have.
Does the party need to do more in terms of building a farm team or searching for better candidates?
Well, I think both parties do that as much as they possibly can.
Do you think the party can bounce back?
Oh, yeah.
Party can bounce back from this in 2 years?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, you know, this is, you had a president on the ballot who's very unpopular. I mean, what was the final total on percentages? Yeah, so what?
24, I think.
What?
24%.
A 24% margin. Yeah. Oh, I mean, you know, a 24% margin's a landslide. And so that's not going to be on the ballot in 2 years. And I think a lot will depend on what they see happen this time in the legislature. Yeah, I think a lot will depend on how this legislative session goes. If it goes like I think it's going to go, and that people do work together, then there will be a lot of incumbents reelected.
You mentioned in 2010
If they don't work together, if the perception ends up being akin to what's going on in Washington, then there will be a lot of incumbents that won't be reelected. That's, you asked for my, I guess, projection on that. That's my projection.
Well, I guess based on those numbers, how's cooperation help Democrats if cooperation?
Well, I think non-cooperation by Democrats will be held against Democrats, just like non-cooperation against Republicans would be held. I think gridlock and non-cooperation is a bipartisan issue. I think it cuts both ways.
You mentioned that 2010 was a GOP surge, and it really didn't happen necessarily last night. Obviously, they overtook the Senate and House most likely. Does it make it, kind of asking questions, does that make it easier to govern the next years, knowing that it wasn't completely taken over by
Oh yeah, it's either going to be easier or harder depending on your perspective. It's not changed on from my standpoint. I knew all along it was going to be close, a relatively equal division, just like it was last time. It was relatively equal last time. But that didn't make it necessarily any harder. When it was in 08, what was it, 78-22 in the House, something like that? It was hard. But it wasn't hard based on parties. It was hard based on other things. It was hard based on rural-urban. It was hard based on some social issues with very conservative Democrats and very liberal Democrats knocking heads. Governing's not for the weak-hearted, and anybody wanting to run for governor better understand it. It takes a lot of give and take and working with lots of diverse kind of folks, because that's what Arkansas is. We're diverse. We send all kinds of different people to represent, and that's the beauty of Arkansas. I think that's an asset, not a detriment. Did I answer your question?
You did. Follow-up, Lieutenant Governor last night at the GOP watch party that was at said, wasn't a good night for Democrats. The next 4 years is going to be equally horrible, paraphrasing. What do you think of that type of statement? Oh,
I think I hope it's just his rhetoric in the heat of a political moment, and I'll chalk it down to that and give him the benefit of the doubt. If his attitude persists in coming weeks, then it, in my opinion, will be inconsistent with what Senator Lamoureux has suggested is going to happen.
With your plans for next year, you talked about your priority still being the grocery tax. Are you definitely going to propose a cut in the grocery tax next year?
I'll let you know.
Republicans have been talking about income tax reduction. Thoughts on that? Is that something you're...
It's not my top priority. My top priority on tax relief is food. Now, having said that, you're going to see this next week. You're first going to see it probably Tuesday, and then you're going to get more detail. When's the 15th?
Thursday.
Thursday. We're making some progress on Medicaid shortfall, but we're still going to have a major problem in Medicaid shortfall, and there are going to be some tough decisions and some cuts that have to be made, even with the progress that we're working on and things we're trying to do. So before anybody starts talking about tax relief, they better put some real names and faces and people in their priority list and look at what our budget looks like. Because even though we've done better than just about everybody, part of that's is the reason for why we're got a Medicaid shortfall. Let me say this again, because I don't see y'all writing it very much or broadcasting it very much, and it needs to be broadcast. We're probably the victim of our own success because we've passed other states and climbed the state rankings in per capita income. Our Medicaid match from the federal government changes. We're going from roughly 75-25, where the feds pay 75% and the state pays 25%, to roughly 70-30, which means we got to pay a lot more of the share of existing Medicaid. That's got nothing to do with payment reform or expansion or anything else. Just existing Medicaid. Our share goes up because we're doing better. because Arkansans are doing better per capita vis-a-vis their sister states. What wonderful news, what we strive for. Well, here's the downside. The downside is they make us pay a bigger share of the existing Medicaid budget. And every point is something like $40 million. So, I mean, it's a big deal on just the existing Medicaid program. So, all of that has to be factored in when you're talking about tax relief. And here's the other beauty of this system. It's easy to espouse a bunch of stuff in a campaign. We hear it all the time. It's easy to be in the opposition. When you got to govern, when you assume that responsibility and you have to govern, then you've got to make decisions that sometimes are very difficult and inconsistent with that rhetoric or inconsistent with that past conduct. I have every confidence that the majority, not all, the majority of the men and women in both the Senate and the House, both Republicans and Democrats, will rise to the occasion and meet those governing responsibilities in a typical Arkansas, common sense, pragmatic fashion. So I guess it's just my fate in life to go through looking at the glass half full all the time. But I have enormous confidence in the majority of the people that get elected to do what I think has to be done to keep Arkansas moving in the direction she's been moving in. You know, I don't care what you say, notwithstanding some of the rhetoric during the campaign, all the objective data and criteria suggest Arkansas's made enormous progress, especially vis-a-vis our sister states in a number of wonderful areas. Incidentally, from this past weekend, every one of those folks, I think, that were kind of on the verge of all that stuff you covered over the weekend, I think they all won.